Sergeant Robert Callahan of the United States 106th Infantry Division crouched in a frozen foxhole near the Belgian village of Schonberg on the evening of December 15, 1944, watching his breath form white clouds in the bitter cold, while contemplating how fortunate his unit seemed to be assigned to this quiet sector of the front, where the war felt distant and abstract compared to the savage fighting occurring in other areas where American forces were pushing toward the Rhine River and the German heartland beyond. The 106th had arrived in the Ardennes region only days earlier after crossing the Atlantic and completing the journey through France to the front lines, the division's soldiers being fresh replacements with minimal combat experience who had been positioned in this supposedly calm area, specifically because senior commanders believed the rugged terrain and difficult weather made major German operations unlikely, in a sector that could serve as a training ground where new units could acclimate to frontline conditions without facing the intensity of active combat zones. Callahan had joined the Army 2 years earlier straight from a small farming community in Iowa, his military training having been thorough but compressed as the demand for replacement soldiers to fill gaps created by months of sustained combat operations across Europe required the training system to process recruits as quickly as possible, while still providing the basic skills needed for survival in modern warfare. The Ardennes sector stretched across 70 miles of forested hills and deep valleys along the German-Belgian border, the terrain being so challenging that American commanders had concentrated their strongest forces to the north, where the approach to Germany's industrial Ruhr region offered clear strategic objectives, and to the south where General Patton's Third Army was driving toward the Saar region. The extended frontage meant that divisions like the 106th were stretched thin, with companies holding positions that doctrine suggested required battalion strength, the gaps between strongpoints being covered only by patrols, and by the assumption that the difficult terrain would slow any German attacks enough to allow reserves time to respond before penetrations became dangerous. Intelligence assessments flowing from higher headquarters consistently indicated that German forces opposite the Ardennes were weak and demoralized, composed mainly of second-rate static divisions with limited mobility and with such severe shortages of fuel and ammunition that sustained offensive operations were considered impossible. These assessments were based on reasonable analysis of German losses during the summer campaigns, when Allied forces had destroyed much of Germany's armor and had inflicted casualties that could not be fully replaced, given the Reich's shrinking manpower pool and industrial capacity under sustained Allied bombing. What the intelligence analysts failed to consider was the possibility that Germany might be willing to gamble everything on a desperate counteroffensive that sought not to win the war, but to create conditions where a negotiated peace might become possible, by demonstrating that the Allied advance could be stopped and perhaps even reversed through bold operational action. Callahan's platoon had spent recent days improving their defensive positions while adjusting to the routines of frontline service, the work including deepening foxholes in the frozen ground that resisted entrenching tools, stringing barbed wire across likely approach routes, and establishing fields of fire that would allow machine guns to cover the gaps between positions. The soldiers performed these tasks with the mixture of griping and dark humor that characterized military units throughout history, the complaints about the cold and the hard labor being combined with jokes that barely masked the underlying anxiety about what combat would be like when it finally came. Most of Callahan's men were teenagers or barely into their 20s, many having been in high school just months earlier, before the draft had pulled them from familiar lives and thrust them into an army fighting on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean, in a war whose strategic complexities they understood only vaguely. The sergeants and officers leading these young soldiers were often only marginally more experienced, the casualties among junior leaders during the summer fighting having created a shortage that was filled by rapid promotions that gave men authority and responsibility before they had accumulated the experience that traditionally preceded such advancement. Callahan himself had been promoted to sergeant after only 6 months in the Army, based more on his performance in training than on any demonstrated combat leadership, his 3 stripes representing potential rather than proven capability in situations where lives depended on making correct decisions under conditions of chaos and extreme stress. The night of December 15th passed quietly with only occasional sounds of distant artillery and the rustle of wind through the pine forests that covered the hills surrounding the American positions. Callahan stood watch during the early morning hours, stamping his feet to maintain circulation in the sub-zero temperatures while scanning the dark tree line for any sign of German movement. The standing orders were to report any unusual activity immediately, but defining unusual in a frontline area where small patrols from both sides probed enemy positions nightly, and where occasional artillery fire was routine, proved difficult when nothing in the training had prepared soldiers for the actual sensory experience of frontline service, where every sound and movement could be innocent or could be the prelude to attack. The forest sounds that would have been unremarkable in civilian life took on sinister significance in combat zones where German soldiers were known to be somewhere in that darkness, and where the price of inattention could be measured in American lives. As dawn approached on December 16th, Callahan noticed what seemed like increased vehicle noise from the German side of the lines, the sound of engines and the metallic clanking that suggested tracked vehicles moving into position. He reported these observations to his platoon leader, who acknowledged the information, but indicated that similar reports from other positions had been dismissed by battalion intelligence as normal supply movements or routine defensive adjustments, the assessment being that nothing suggested preparation for major offensive action. The German artillery barrage that erupted at dawn shattered the winter morning, with a violence and intensity that exceeded anything the young American soldiers had imagined, despite months of training that included exposure to live fire exercises designed to accustom troops to the sounds and sensations of combat. The shells began falling across the entire division front simultaneously, the coordination indicating that this was a planned operation rather than a reactive local action, with hundreds of guns firing in a carefully orchestrated program that walked explosions across American positions with methodical precision. Callahan's foxhole shuddered from nearby impacts as frozen earth and shattered trees rained down around him, the explosions creating a continuous roar punctuated by the sharper cracks of shells hitting closer, and by the screams of wounded men that could be heard in the brief intervals between detonations. The psychological impact of sustained artillery fire on soldiers experiencing their first combat was overwhelming, with some men becoming catatonic and unable to respond to commands while others panicked and attempted to flee their positions despite the greater danger of being caught in the open during a barrage. Callahan found himself functioning on automatic responses drilled into him during training, checking on his soldiers between explosions and trying to maintain unit cohesion, despite the fear that threatened to paralyze rational thought and reduce everyone to terrified animals seeking only to escape the immediate danger. The German bombardment continued for nearly 2 hours, far longer than the typical artillery preparations that preceded attacks in other sectors, where ammunition shortages forced German gunners to conserve shells. The sustained nature of the barrage indicated that German forces had accumulated substantial ammunition stocks specifically for this operation, another data point suggesting that Allied intelligence had badly misjudged German capabilities and intentions in the Ardennes sector. When the artillery fire finally ceased, the sudden silence was almost as disorienting as the noise had been, with soldiers' ears ringing and their senses struggling to readjust to the absence of explosions after the sustained assault on their nervous systems. Callahan emerged from his foxhole to assess the damage and discovered that his platoon had suffered significant casualties, with 3 men killed by direct hits and 7 more wounded seriously enough to require medical evacuation, if such evacuation were possible given the confused tactical situation. The defensive positions that had seemed substantial before the barrage now appeared fragile and inadequate, with many fighting positions collapsed or filled with debris, and with the carefully planned fields of fire being obscured by the smoke and dust that hung over the battlefield like a fog. The German infantry assault that followed the artillery preparation was preceded by searchlights being turned on to illuminate the American positions, the technique being designed to blind defenders while backlighting them for attackers advancing from the darkness beyond the light beams. The psychological effect of the searchlights combined with loudspeakers broadcasting propaganda and threats in English created an atmosphere of unreality that made the situation feel like something from a nightmare rather than actual combat. Callahan ordered his remaining soldiers to hold their fire until German infantry came within effective range. The discipline required to implement this order being difficult to maintain, when instinct urged immediate response to visible threats, approaching through the artificial dawn created by the searchlights. The first German soldiers to emerge from the forest were wearing white winter camouflage that made them blend into the snowy landscape, their tactical movement indicating that these were experienced troops, rather than the low-quality units that intelligence briefings had led the Americans to expect. The volume of German infantry became apparent as more and more soldiers appeared, their numbers suggesting that this was an attack by multiple battalions rather than the company-strength probes that characterized normal operations in quiet sectors. The American defensive fire that erupted when German troops closed to within 200 yards cut down the leading elements and forced the attack to slow as soldiers sought cover and as German supporting weapons began suppressing American positions. Callahan's machine gunner fired controlled bursts that swept across the approaching Germans with devastating effect, the training in fire discipline paying dividends as ammunition was conserved while still achieving maximum casualties among the attacking force. But the Germans adapted quickly to the defensive fire, using smoke grenades to obscure American observation and bringing forward more supporting weapons, including mortars that could strike American positions without exposing German infantry to direct fire. The tactical sophistication being displayed by the German attack indicated that this was a carefully planned operation executed by quality troops rather than a hasty improvisation by desperate defenders, the realization creating a sinking feeling among the American soldiers who understood that they were facing a serious threat rather than a manageable local attack. As the battle developed through the morning, Callahan became aware that German forces had penetrated American lines in multiple locations, with sounds of combat coming from positions that should have been in American hands, and with runners reporting that neighboring units had been overrun or forced to withdraw under pressure that they could not contain. The isolation of Callahan's position became complete when German forces cut the roads behind the American front line, severing supply routes and preventing reinforcements from reaching the forward positions that were now effectively surrounded. The field radios that should have allowed communication with higher headquarters were not functioning properly, whether due to German jamming or to the chaotic tactical situation that had disrupted command networks was unclear. Callahan made the decision to hold his position as ordered, rather than attempting to withdraw through German lines that now existed in areas that had been American rear areas just hours earlier, the choice being between fighting from prepared positions with diminishing ammunition or attempting a breakout that would expose his soldiers to German fire while moving through unfamiliar terrain. The afternoon brought renewed German attacks, as enemy commanders committed additional forces to reducing the American strongpoints that continued resisting despite being cut off from support. Callahan's ammunition situation became critical, as machine gun belts were exhausted, and as rifle ammunition dwindled to the point where controlled fire discipline became essential to avoid running completely dry before the next German assault. The medical situation was equally desperate, with wounded men requiring treatment that the platoon medic could not provide given the severity of injuries, and the limited medical supplies available in forward positions designed for brief combat rather than sustained battles. As darkness fell on December 16th, Callahan's platoon had been reduced to less than half strength through casualties that could not be replaced, and through the psychological attrition that left some soldiers unable to continue functioning effectively, despite lacking physical wounds. The tactical situation was clearly untenable, with ammunition nearly exhausted, wounded men requiring evacuation, and German forces surrounding the position on three sides. But the order to hold had not been countermanded, and Callahan felt obligated to maintain his position until receiving explicit instructions to withdraw, or until the situation became absolutely hopeless. The night brought only brief respite, as German forces probed the American positions, testing for weaknesses while avoiding major assaults in darkness that would negate some of their advantages. Callahan used the lull to redistribute ammunition among his remaining soldiers and to prepare demolitions that would destroy weapons and equipment if withdrawal or surrender became necessary, the prospect of capture being something that none of them had seriously considered when imagining combat, but which now seemed like a real possibility if the situation continued deteriorating. You have just experienced the first 24 hours of Hitler's last major gamble on the Western Front, through the eyes of men who went from training exercises to desperate combat without transition, learning in hours what months of preparation had failed to teach them about the reality of modern warfare. Robert Callahan and thousands of other American soldiers discovered that quiet sectors could explode into intense combat without warning, and that intelligence assessments about enemy capabilities could be catastrophically wrong when adversaries were willing to accept enormous risks. Subscribe to this channel because we show you combat from the perspective of the soldiers who fought it, rather than from the sanitized view of headquarters briefings and official histories. Comment below and tell us whether you would have held that position as ordered or attempted to break out through enemy lines when ammunition ran low and help was not coming. What would you have done in Callahan's frozen foxhole when every decision could mean life or death for the men depending on your leadership? Share your thoughts about how soldiers make impossible choices and what you want to learn about the battles that tested human endurance beyond any reasonable limits. The morning of December 17th brought no relief to Callahan's surrounded position as German forces continued their advance deeper into American-held territory, bypassing strong points that continued resisting rather than wasting time reducing them when the strategic objective was to exploit the breakthrough and reach objectives far behind the original American front lines. The sounds of tracked vehicles moving along roads that had been American supply routes just 36 hours earlier indicated that German armor was now operating in areas where rear echelon units had no capacity to resist tanks and assault guns, the realization creating a sense that the entire front had collapsed and that organized American defense had been replaced by chaos, where isolated units fought their own private battles without coordination or mutual support. Callahan's soldiers could hear American artillery firing from positions to the west, but the fire missions were not supporting their position, suggesting that higher headquarters had written off the forward units as lost, and was instead trying to establish new defensive lines further back, where reserves might be able to contain the German penetration before it achieved operational breakout. The decision to abandon forward units without attempting relief operations or ordering withdrawal was tactically sound from the perspective of commanders trying to prevent catastrophic defeat of the entire army. But for the soldiers being abandoned, it felt like betrayal by a command structure that had assured them they would receive support if serious fighting developed. German loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in English throughout the morning, the messages promising that prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Conventions, and that continued resistance served no purpose now that American positions had been surrounded and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or supply. Some of Callahan's soldiers advocated surrender as the only rational response to a hopeless situation where ammunition was nearly exhausted, and where holding the position could achieve nothing beyond adding to casualty lists without affecting the battle's outcome. Others argued that surrender to an enemy whose treatment of prisoners could not be trusted would be worse than fighting to the last round, and that their duty was to hold the position regardless of the tactical situation, until ordered otherwise by competent authority. Callahan wrestled with these competing arguments, while recognizing that his decision would determine whether these young men lived or died, and whether they would go home to their families after the war, or would spend months or years in prison camps where survival would depend on factors beyond their control. The weight of command responsibility that military training had discussed in abstract terms became concrete and crushing when the decision involved real men whose lives hung on choices made without adequate information about the larger tactical situation or about what higher commanders expected from units that had been bypassed by the German advance. The tactical situation clarified somewhat during the afternoon, when an American patrol that had broken out from another surrounded position reached Callahan's foxholes and reported that entire regiments of the 106th Division had been cut off in a pocket, forming around the Schnee-Eifel Ridge system, where the division's frontline positions had been concentrated. The patrol leader estimated that 8,000 to 10,000 American soldiers were trapped in the pocket, with German forces controlling all the roads, and with attempts to break out being repulsed by German units positioned specifically to contain the surrounded Americans until they exhausted their supplies and were forced to surrender. The news that Callahan's unit was part of a much larger encirclement rather than an isolated position provided some context, but offered little comfort, given that the larger the pocket became, the more difficult organizing any relief operation would be, and the less likely that higher headquarters would risk additional forces attempting to rescue units that had already been written off as combat losses. The patrol also brought information about the broader German offensive, reporting that attacks had struck along a 60-mile front, with apparent objectives including the capture of critical road junctions at Bastogne and St. Vith, and potentially driving all the way to Antwerp, to split the Allied armies and capture the port facilities that supplied the entire northern sector of the front. German attacks resumed in late afternoon as enemy commanders sought to compress the pocket and eliminate the American strongpoints that continued tying down forces needed for the continued offensive westward. Callahan's position came under assault by German infantry supported by assault guns that fired high-explosive rounds directly into the American foxholes, from ranges where the thin armor on these vehicles was not vulnerable to the small arms fire that represented the only weapons Callahan's soldiers still possessed. The combination of direct fire from assault guns and coordinated infantry attacks overwhelmed the American defenses that had already been weakened by 2 days of sustained combat, and by the ammunition shortages that forced defenders to hold fire until German soldiers were almost on top of their positions. Callahan's machine gunner was killed by a direct hit from an assault gun, the loss eliminating the most effective weapon in the American defensive arsenal, and forcing reliance on rifles that could not generate sufficient volume of fire to stop determined attacks. The German infantry broke into the American positions during the assault, turning the fight into close-quarters combat where soldiers fought with rifles used as clubs, and where the outcome was determined by numbers and by the desperation of men fighting for survival rather than by any tactical sophistication. The surrender, when it came, was not a deliberate decision, but rather an organic development as soldiers individually recognized that continued resistance was futile, and that dying in a foxhole in Belgium would serve no purpose when the battle had already been lost at higher levels of command. Callahan found himself among the last group still fighting, firing his final rifle rounds at German soldiers who were already accepting the surrender of Americans emerging from nearby foxholes with their hands raised. The moment of laying down his weapon and raising his hands represented a personal defeat that transcended the military situation, the acknowledgement that he had been unable to hold his position or to protect his men from capture, creating a sense of failure that would persist long after the war ended, and the strategic irrelevance of his position's fall became apparent. The German soldiers who took Callahan and his surviving men prisoner were professional and correct in their initial treatment, searching prisoners for weapons and intelligence materials, but not engaging in the abuse or murder that propaganda had suggested might occur. The German squad leader who processed Callahan's surrender spoke adequate English and expressed what seemed like genuine sympathy for the American situation, commenting that his own unit had experienced similar encirclements during the retreat through France, and that being surrounded was simply a misfortune of war, rather than a reflection on the soldiers who had fought well before being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. The march into captivity began immediately with German guards herding the American prisoners eastward through the forest, along trails that avoided the main roads where American artillery might still reach. Callahan and his men joined hundreds of other prisoners from units across the 106th Division that had been captured during the first 2 days of the German offensive, the column of defeated Americans growing longer as more surrounded positions were reduced, and as soldiers who had attempted to break out individually or in small groups, were rounded up by German security forces, screening the rear areas of the advance. The physical condition of the prisoners varied widely, with some having sustained wounds that had received no treatment beyond hasty field dressings, and others suffering from frostbite caused by prolonged exposure in frozen foxholes without adequate winter clothing. The psychological state of the prisoners reflected shock at how quickly their situation had deteriorated from quiet sector duty to combat to capture. The rapidity of events having prevented the kind of gradual psychological adjustment that longer combat deployments might have allowed. Many prisoners exhibited symptoms of combat exhaustion, including the 1,000-yard stare that characterized soldiers who had witnessed more violence and death than their minds could process, their withdrawal into themselves being a protective mechanism that allowed some temporary escape from memories that would haunt them for decades after the war ended. The German prisoner of war camps that received the Americans captured during the Ardennes offensive were unprepared for the sudden influx of thousands of prisoners arriving in the middle of winter, when camp facilities were already inadequate for the existing prisoner population. Callahan's group was processed through a transit camp where German administrators recorded basic information about each prisoner, including name, rank, serial number, and unit, the information being compiled for transmission to the International Red Cross that would eventually notify American authorities and families that these soldiers had been captured rather than killed. The processing was bureaucratic and impersonal, with German clerks treating prisoners as administrative problems to be documented and forwarded to permanent camps, rather than as individuals whose capture represented personal catastrophe and the end of their participation in the war. The barracks where prisoners were temporarily housed were overcrowded and unheated, the German explanation being that coal shortages affected military camps as well as civilian populations, and that prisoners could not expect better conditions than German soldiers received. The food provided was minimal and of poor quality, consisting mainly of thin soup and small portions of black bread that left prisoners constantly hungry and losing weight at rates that would become dangerous if maintained for extended periods without supplementation from Red Cross parcels that might or might not arrive depending on whether supply lines remained intact. The interrogations that followed initial processing were conducted by German intelligence officers seeking information about American units, equipment, and operational plans that might be valuable for understanding the forces opposing the German offensive. Callahan was questioned repeatedly about his division's strength, about the locations of higher headquarters, about plans for counterattacks, and about the morale of American troops after the shock of the German breakthrough. He provided only the name, rank, and serial number that Geneva Conventions specified as the minimum information prisoners were required to give, resisting German attempts to extract additional details through a combination of friendly approaches suggesting that providing information would improve his treatment, and more threatening interrogations implying that uncooperative prisoners might be classified as spies rather than legitimate combatants. The German interrogators were professional and generally adhered to the conventions governing treatment of prisoners, their methods being based on psychological manipulation rather than physical abuse, though the threat of harsher treatment remained implicit in questions about whether prisoners wished to be classified as soldiers entitled to convention protections or as illegal combatants subject to other handling. The interrogation experience reinforced for Callahan the importance of maintaining discipline and refusing to provide information beyond the minimum required. His resistance to German questioning techniques providing some small way of continuing to fight, even after being captured and disarmed. The permanent camp where Callahan eventually arrived after several transfers was located in eastern Germany, the location being chosen specifically to make escape attempts impractical, given the hundreds of miles that would need to be crossed to reach Allied lines or neutral territory. The camp housed thousands of prisoners from multiple nations, including Americans, British, French, and Soviet soldiers, the different nationalities being segregated into separate compounds that prevented communication and organization across national groups. The physical conditions in the camp were harsh, with overcrowded barracks, inadequate sanitation facilities, minimal food rations, and virtually no medical care for the sick and wounded among the prisoner population. The German camp administration maintained that these conditions reflected Germany's overall economic situation, rather than deliberate mistreatment of prisoners, the argument being that German civilians and soldiers also suffered from shortages created by Allied bombing and by the military situation that strained German resources to the breaking point. Whether this explanation justified the conditions, or whether German authorities had an obligation to prioritize prisoner welfare over other demands, remained a question that international law addressed ambiguously, and that practical reality answered through the prisoners' daily experience of cold, hunger, and disease that killed significant numbers before liberation finally came. The news about the broader war situation that filtered into the prison camp through various channels, including newly arrived prisoners, German guards willing to discuss military developments, and clandestinely obtained newspapers created a complex picture of the German offensive's progress and ultimate failure. Initial reports suggested that German forces had achieved significant penetrations and had captured thousands of American prisoners, including most of 2 regiments from Callahan's division. But later information indicated that the offensive had stalled before reaching its objectives, and that American forces had contained the breakthrough through a combination of desperate defensive stands at critical road junctions and rapid movement of reserves that prevented German exploitation of the initial tactical successes. The siege of Bastogne became legendary even among prisoners who heard stories about American paratroopers holding the town despite being surrounded, and despite German demands for surrender. The resistance at Bastogne buying time for Patton's Third Army to counterattack from the south and relieve the garrison before German forces could capture the critical road junction. The news that the German offensive had ultimately failed provided some consolation to prisoners who understood that their sacrifice had not been entirely in vain, if their division's destruction had contributed to slowing the German advance and allowing time for effective American response at higher command levels. The daily routine in the prison camp consisted mainly of attempts to stay warm, to supplement inadequate rations through whatever means were available, and to maintain some semblance of military organization and discipline despite the demoralization that captivity inevitably created. Callahan found that maintaining routine and purpose helped prisoners cope with the psychological challenges of captivity. The structure provided by organized activities, preventing the descent into despair that affected prisoners who had nothing to occupy their time and thoughts beyond dwelling on their situation. The senior American officers in the camp established a command structure that attempted to maintain morale and to address grievances with German authorities through proper channels, their efforts being partially successful in securing minor improvements in conditions while also providing prisoners with sense that they remained part of military organization, rather than simply being abandoned victims of war's fortunes. The entertainment and educational activities that prisoners organized using whatever materials could be obtained helped maintain mental health and provided distraction from the hunger, cold, and uncertainty about when or whether liberation would come. The religious services conducted by chaplains among the prisoners provided spiritual comfort and reinforced connections to values and beliefs that transcended immediate circumstances. The faith that sustained many prisoners through captivity being tested, but ultimately strengthened by the experience of suffering and survival. The months of captivity stretched into early 1945 as winter gave way to spring, and as news from the fronts indicated that Allied armies were advancing into Germany from both east and west, with the Soviet forces approaching from one direction, and American and British forces crossing the Rhine from the other. The approaching end of the war created both hope and anxiety among prisoners, who understood that liberation was coming, but who also worried about what desperate German authorities might do to prisoners in the war's final chaotic weeks. The evacuation of camps in the path of advancing Soviet forces created death marches where prisoners were force-marched westward in winter conditions without adequate food or shelter. The death toll from these marches sometimes exceeding the casualties from years of captivity as weakened prisoners succumbed to exposure, starvation, and the brutality of guards who shot stragglers unable to maintain the pace. Callahan's camp was eventually liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945, the arrival of Soviet tanks breaking through the gates and overwhelming the German guards who had already largely abandoned their posts as the military situation collapsed, creating general chaos across Germany in the war's final weeks. The immediate aftermath of liberation brought relief mixed with new challenges, as former prisoners struggled to adjust to freedom after months of captivity that had created physical and psychological damage, requiring extended recovery time. Callahan weighed perhaps 40 pounds less than his normal weight, the chronic malnutrition of prison camp rations having consumed muscle mass and left him physically weakened to the point where simple tasks required effort that would have been trivial before his capture. The Soviet liberators provided food and basic medical care, but lacked the resources to fully address the needs of thousands of liberated prisoners who required repatriation through Soviet-controlled territory before they could reach American collection points where proper care would be available. The journey westward through the devastation of eastern Germany revealed the scale of destruction that the war had inflicted on the civilian population, with cities reduced to rubble, and with displaced persons crowding the roads in desperate searches for surviving family members or simply for locations where basic survival needs of food and shelter might be met. The sight of German civilians suffering through the consequences of the war their government had launched created complex emotions among the liberated prisoners, with some feeling satisfaction at German suffering, while others experienced uncomfortable recognition that the distinction between guilty Nazi leadership and ordinary German civilians who had not chosen the war was morally significant even if practically difficult to maintain. The repatriation through American processing centers in France involved medical examinations that documented the physical damage captivity had caused, psychological evaluations that attempted to assess mental health and readiness to return to duty or to civilian life, and extensive debriefings about prison camp conditions and about any intelligence regarding German military capabilities that prisoners might have observed during their captivity. Callahan's debriefing focused partly on his combat experience during the opening days of the Bulge offensive, with intelligence officers seeking to understand how German attacks had achieved such surprise and why American defensive positions had collapsed so quickly in some sectors. The questions about whether better intelligence preparation or different tactical dispositions might have prevented the disaster that befell the 106th Division were difficult to answer given Callahan's limited perspective as a platoon sergeant who had operated with fragmentary information about the broader tactical situation, but his first-hand account of the German artillery preparation and the quality of German infantry contributed to the larger picture that military historians would eventually construct about how the offensive had been planned and executed. The debriefing about prison camp conditions provided information that would be used in war crimes investigations, examining whether German treatment of prisoners had violated Geneva Conventions, Callahan's testimony about inadequate rations and medical care being balanced against his acknowledgement that conditions had been harsh rather than deliberately abusive, and that German explanations about resource shortages appeared credible given the overall situation Germany faced in the war's final months. The physical recovery from months of malnutrition and the injuries sustained during combat and captivity required extended hospitalization and rehabilitation that kept Callahan in military medical facilities for weeks after liberation. The medical care he received was professional and comprehensive, with doctors addressing not only the obvious physical damage, but also the less visible psychological trauma that combat and captivity had created. The nightmares that began during his hospitalization would continue for years, with Callahan experiencing recurring dreams of the artillery barrage and of the moment when German soldiers had broken into his position, forcing the surrender that he still perceived as personal failure, despite rational understanding that he had done everything possible under impossible circumstances. The medical staff treating former prisoners recognized that psychological wounds required attention alongside physical injuries, though the treatment options available in 1945 were limited compared to what later understanding of post-traumatic stress would develop. The therapy consisted mainly of talking with chaplains and psychiatrists who encouraged prisoners to discuss their experiences and to recognize that their reactions were normal responses to abnormal situations rather than signs of personal weakness or mental illness requiring shame or concealment. The question of whether Callahan would return to combat duty or be sent home became moot when Germany surrendered in May 1945, ending the war in Europe and beginning the massive demobilization that would return millions of servicemen to civilian life over the following months. The point system that determined discharge priority gave heavy weight to time in service, overseas service, and combat awards, with additional points for injuries and for time spent as prisoner of war. Callahan's point total qualified him for relatively early discharge, his return to the United States coming in summer 1945 aboard one of the transport ships that ferried former prisoners and other high-priority personnel across the Atlantic toward home and toward the difficult process of readjusting to civilian society, after experiences that had changed them in ways that people who had not lived through combat and captivity could never fully understand. The voyage home provided time for reflection on what the previous months had meant, and on how to integrate those experiences into a life that would need to move forward, rather than remaining trapped in memories of frozen foxholes and prison barracks that represented just a brief period of his life, but which had contained more intensity and significance than years of normal peacetime existence could match. The arrival in New York Harbor and the sight of the Statue of Liberty created powerful emotional responses among the returning soldiers, the symbol of freedom and home-taking on enhanced meaning for men who had experienced captivity and who had wondered whether they would ever see their homeland again. The processing through separation centers involved final medical examinations, completion of discharge paperwork, and receipt of back pay and benefits owed to soldiers who were transitioning to veteran status and to the civilian lives that awaited them. Callahan received his discharge papers and travel vouchers for the train journey back to Iowa where his family waited, their knowledge of his capture and eventual liberation having come through official channels and through Red Cross notifications that provided basic information without details about what he had experienced during the months between his capture and his liberation. The prospect of returning home created anxiety as well as joy, with Callahan wondering how to explain what had happened to people who had not been there and who would struggle to comprehend experiences that seemed to belong to a different world than the farming community where he had grown up, and where life continued according to patterns that war had not fundamentally disrupted, despite the absence of men who were serving overseas. You now understand that the Battle of the Bulge was not just about famous stands at Bastogne or about Patton's dramatic relief operations, but also about thousands of soldiers like Robert Callahan, who fought in positions that were overrun and who spent the war's final months as prisoners rather than as heroes celebrated in newspaper headlines. Their experience was no less significant than that of soldiers who held their ground, or who counterattacked successfully, their sacrifice contributing to the overall Allied victory, even though their individual stories ended in capture rather than triumph. Subscribe to this channel because we tell the complete story of warfare, including the defeats and the captivity that official histories often minimize or ignore, in favor of focusing on victories and successful operations. Comment below and share what other aspects of World War II you want us to explore, whether it's more about prisoner of war experiences, about battles that are less famous than D-Day or the Bulge, or about the home front and the civilians who supported the war effort. Tell us which stories matter to you and which untold histories deserve to be documented before the generation that lived them is gone and their first-hand testimony is lost forever. The homecoming to Iowa that Callahan experienced in late summer 1945 brought the complicated mixture of relief and disconnection that characterized many veterans' returns to civilian communities that had been changed by war, but which had not experienced the direct violence and trauma that combat soldiers carried with them from the battlefields of Europe. His family greeted him with genuine joy, tempered by visible shock at his physical condition, despite months of recovery that had restored much of the weight he had lost during captivity. The lingering effects of malnutrition and the psychological weight he carried being apparent to people who had known him before the war transformed him from a carefree young man into someone whose eyes reflected experiences that could not be easily communicated or understood by those who had remained safely at home. The small farming community organized a welcome celebration that honored all returning veterans with speeches by local officials and ceremonies recognizing their service. But Callahan found these public events uncomfortable and somewhat hollow, given that they focused on abstract notions of duty and sacrifice, rather than engaging with the actual experiences of combat, capture, and the moral complexities that war created for participants who had killed enemies and watched friends die in ways that patriotic rhetoric could not adequately capture or explain. The transition to civilian life proved more difficult than Callahan had anticipated during the months of captivity, when fantasies about returning home sustained him through the hardships of prison camp existence. The routines of farm work that had been his expected future before military service now seemed mundane and pointless compared to the intensity of combat, where every moment carried significance and where decisions had immediate life-or-death consequences that made peacetime choices about crop rotations and equipment maintenance feel trivial by comparison. The physical labor that farming demanded was challenging given his reduced strength and stamina. Though he pushed himself to match the work output that had been normal before the war, despite the toll this exertion took on a body still recovering from months of inadequate nutrition and from injuries that had not fully healed. The social interactions with neighbors and townspeople who wanted to hear war stories but who had no framework for understanding what he described created frustration, as Callahan found himself either providing sanitized accounts that bore little resemblance to actual experiences or attempting honest descriptions that made listeners uncomfortable and that marked him as someone who dwelled excessively on unpleasant memories rather than moving forward with normal life. The nightmares that had begun during his hospitalization continued and intensified after his return home, with Callahan frequently waking in the darkness of his childhood bedroom disoriented and convinced that he was still in the foxhole or in the prison barracks until full consciousness returned and allowed him to recognize his actual surroundings. The dreams replayed the artillery barrage with vivid sensory details, including the sounds of explosions and the smell of cordite mixed with the metallic scent of blood, or they recreated the moment of surrender when he had been forced to acknowledge defeat and to place himself and his men at the mercy of enemies whose treatment of prisoners could not be predicted with certainty. Some nights the dream shifted to the prison camp, where hunger was constant and where the cold penetrated through inadequate clothing and thin blankets that provided no real protection against the German winter, the physical sensations being so real that Callahan would wake feeling the cold despite the warmth of summer nights in Iowa. His family heard him moving through the house during these sleepless hours, but did not know how to address his obvious distress, their awkward attempts to discuss what was troubling him being met with vague reassurances that everything was fine, and that the adjustment to civilian life simply required time to complete. The relationship with his parents and siblings that had been easy and natural before the war became strained by the changes that military service and combat had created in Callahan's personality and perspective. His younger brother, who had been too young for military service, continued living the life that Callahan had expected to live if the war had not intervened, working the family farm and courting a local girl with plans for marriage and establishing his own household within the familiar community where generations of their family had lived. Callahan found himself simultaneously envying this normal trajectory and feeling contempt for its simplicity, and for the assumption that life could proceed according to traditional patterns without acknowledging how the war had disrupted everything, and had revealed that the peaceful existence they took for granted was fragile and dependent on circumstances beyond anyone's control. His mother worried constantly about his weight and his health, trying to feed him the meals she remembered him enjoying before the war, without understanding that his appetite had been permanently affected by months of near starvation that had changed his relationship with food from simple pleasure to complex psychological territory, where hunger triggered memories of the prison camp and where eating sometimes produced nausea rather than satisfaction. The veterans organizations that formed in the community provided some outlet for Callahan to interact with other men who had served in combat, though even within this group the experiences varied so widely that finding common ground proved difficult. Some veterans had served in rear area positions where danger was minimal, and where military service had been mainly an extended period away from home rather than a life-transforming experience, these men being able to reintegrate into civilian life relatively smoothly because they had never experienced the intensity that combat created. Others had seen heavy fighting but in different theaters where the specific challenges and the enemy they faced differed enough that comparing experiences highlighted differences more than similarities. A few had been prisoners of war like Callahan, but their captivity experiences varied depending on which camps they had been held in, and on whether they had been captured early or late in the war, when conditions and German treatment of prisoners reflected different strategic situations. The conversations at veterans' gatherings often gravitated toward shared complaints about civilians who did not understand military service, or about government bureaucracy and processing benefit claims. These safe topics, allowing veterans to bond without delving into memories of combat that remained too painful or too private to discuss even with others who had faced similar experiences. The benefits available to veterans through the GI Bill offered opportunities for education or training that could provide alternatives to the farming life that Callahan had expected to pursue before the war. But taking advantage of these benefits required leaving the familiar community and moving to a city where colleges or technical schools offered programs that were not available in rural Iowa. The decision about whether to remain in the familiar environment where his family and community existed, or to strike out toward new opportunities that might provide better economic prospects, but which would require abandoning the roots that connected him to his past, consumed months of internal debate without clear resolution. His father wanted him to remain on the farm and eventually take over the operation as generations before him had done, this expectation being reasonable from the perspective of someone who had lived his entire life within a 20-mile radius and who could not imagine why anyone would voluntarily leave a community where they had family connections and where their place in the social structure was secure. But Callahan felt that returning to farming would mean accepting limitations and giving up possibilities that the war had revealed existed beyond the boundaries of the small town where he had been born, and where he had assumed he would live out his entire life before the army had taken him to Europe and shown him how large and complex the world actually was. The young woman who Callahan had been courting before his induction had married someone else during his absence, the Dear John letter he received while in the prison camp having ended that relationship and eliminated one of the futures he had imagined while enduring captivity. The small town offered limited prospects for meeting potential partners, given that most women his age were already married or had left for cities where wartime industries had created employment opportunities that rural areas could not match. The loneliness that Callahan experienced went beyond simple lack of romantic relationship to encompass a more fundamental isolation created by the sense that he no longer belonged in the community where he had grown up and where everyone else seemed to fit into established patterns that no longer made sense to him after everything he had experienced. The restlessness that many combat veterans felt manifested in Callahan's increasing dissatisfaction with the routines of farm life and with the limitations of small-town existence, where nothing ever changed, and where the same conversations repeated endlessly, without anyone questioning whether there might be different ways of living or different values worth pursuing beyond the conventional success measured in acres owned and crops harvested. The decision to leave Iowa and pursue education under the GI Bill finally crystallized in early 1946, when Callahan realized that remaining in the familiar community meant accepting a future that felt like slow suffocation. Despite the genuine affection he had for his family and the landscape where he had grown up, he enrolled in a state university several hundred miles away, where he planned to study engineering, the choice of field reflecting both his aptitude for mechanical work that farming had developed and his desire to learn skills that would be applicable in the industrial economy that was rapidly expanding in post-war America, as factories that had produced weapons shifted to manufacturing consumer goods for a population eager to enjoy peacetime prosperity after years of wartime rationing and sacrifice. The transition to college life brought new challenges, including academic work that demanded different skills than either farming or military service had required, social situations where he was older than most students who had come directly from high school without the interruption of military service, and the continuing struggle with nightmares and memories that made concentration difficult when his mind kept returning to the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes or to the hunger of the prison camp that had consumed months of his life. The university campus included significant numbers of veterans taking advantage of educational benefits, creating a community of students whose life experiences differed dramatically from the younger classmates who had not served in the military and who approached college as an extension of their adolescence, rather than as a serious opportunity to prepare for adult responsibilities. Callahan found more in common with fellow veterans than with traditional students, the shared experience of military service creating bonds even when specific wartime experiences differed widely across different branches and theaters. The veterans tended to be more serious about their studies and more focused on completing degrees efficiently rather than treating college as an extended social experience, their maturity and sense of purpose sometimes creating friction with professors who expected traditional student behavior and who were unprepared for older students who questioned authority and who demanded practical justification for academic requirements that seemed arbitrary or irrelevant to their educational goals. The Veterans Administration counselors available on campus provided some assistance with the adjustment challenges that combat veterans faced, though the services were limited and the understanding of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder remained rudimentary in an era when psychological wounds were stigmatized and when veterans were expected to simply move on from their wartime experiences without dwelling on unpleasant memories. The academic work that initially challenged Callahan became easier as he developed study skills and as he discovered that his military experience had taught him discipline and time management that made the demands of university coursework manageable, despite his initial concerns about whether he could compete academically with students who had not experienced the 4-year interruption that military service represented. The engineering curriculum emphasized practical problem-solving and systematic analysis that appealed to Callahan's methodical approach to challenges, the courses providing intellectual engagement that was more satisfying than he had anticipated when making the decision to pursue higher education, rather than accepting the farming life that had been his expected future. The professors teaching engineering courses included some who had contributed to military research during the war, their perspective on how technical knowledge connected to real-world applications, making the abstract mathematics and physics more relevant and interesting than pure academic exercises disconnected from practical use would have been. The laboratories where students built circuits and tested mechanical systems provided hands-on experience that Callahan found particularly valuable given his preference for learning through doing rather than through purely theoretical instruction. The social life at the university gradually expanded beyond the veterans community as Callahan became more comfortable interacting with traditional students, and as he found that his wartime experiences, while setting him apart, also made him interesting to classmates who had grown up during the war, hearing news reports and propaganda, but who had no direct knowledge of what combat or military service actually involved. The requests for war stories that had been uncomfortable in his hometown became less problematic when they came from peers who were genuinely curious rather than from older community members who wanted to fit his experiences into predetermined narratives about heroism and sacrifice that did not match the complexity of what he had actually experienced. He learned to provide accounts that conveyed some of the reality while avoiding details that would be too disturbing or that would create distance between himself and listeners who lacked any frame of reference for understanding what combat and captivity had been like. The sanitized versions felt somewhat dishonest, but seemed necessary for maintaining relationships with people whose friendship and support he needed even if they could never fully understand the experiences that had shaped him. The relationship with a young woman studying education at the university developed gradually from casual friendship to serious courtship over the course of several semesters, her patience with Callahan's occasional emotional withdrawal, and her willingness to accept that there were aspects of his past he could not discuss, creating foundation of trust that allowed genuine intimacy to develop, despite the barriers that his wartime trauma created. She had lost a brother in the Pacific Theater, and understood that military service created wounds that were not always visible, her own experience with grief and loss making her more empathetic than someone without personal connection to the war's costs might have been. The decision to marry came after Callahan completed his degree and secured employment with an engineering firm that was expanding to meet the demand for infrastructure development in rapidly growing post-war suburbs, the job offering financial stability and the prospect of building a normal middle-class life that had seemed impossible during the dark days of captivity, when survival through each day was the maximum ambition he could sustain. The wedding was modest, with attendance limited mainly to immediate family and a few close friends, the celebration being joyful, but also marked by awareness of those who were absent, including Callahan's army buddies who had not survived the war, or who had scattered across the country pursuing their own post-war lives. The construction of a new life during the late 1940s and 1950s involved conscious effort to move beyond the war experiences that continued influencing Callahan in ways both visible and subtle. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never entirely disappeared. Certain triggers, including unexpected loud noises or the smell of smoke, continuing to provoke anxiety responses that required conscious effort to manage. The birth of his children created new focus and purpose that helped contextualize the war experiences as part of his past, rather than as the defining aspect of his identity. Though he remained reluctant to discuss his combat service with his kids when they asked about the war as they grew older and learned about World War II in school. The professional success he achieved in his engineering career provided satisfaction and validation that he could build meaningful life beyond the trauma of combat and captivity, though there remained a sense that nothing in civilian life would ever match the intensity of those months when every decision carried existential weight and when survival was never assured. The marriage endured despite the challenges that his emotional scars created, his wife's patience and understanding being tested, but ultimately sustaining the relationship through difficult periods when the past seemed to overwhelm the present. The commemoration of World War II through public memorials, anniversary observances, and historical documentation that developed over the decades following the conflict created opportunities for Callahan to engage with his wartime experiences in contexts that were more comfortable than the immediate post-war period when wounds were too fresh, and when society wanted veterans to simply readjust without processing the trauma they carried. The reunions of the 106th Infantry Division that began in the 1950s and continued annually for decades brought together survivors of the unit that had been nearly destroyed during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. The gatherings providing opportunities to reconnect with men who shared the specific experiences of that December week when everything had collapsed, and when thousands had been captured or killed in fighting that received less attention than the more famous stands at Bastogne and St. Vith. The conversations at these reunions mixed reminiscence about shared experiences with acknowledgement of friends who had not survived, and with reflection on how the intervening years had treated those who did make it home. Some veterans had thrived in post-war life, while others had struggled with alcoholism, or failed relationships, or inability to maintain stable employment, the different trajectories reflecting both individual resilience and the luck of circumstances that shaped whether veterans received support they needed or were left to manage their trauma without adequate resources. The historical understanding of the Battle of the Bulge that developed through military analysis and popular accounts emphasized certain aspects of the fighting while minimizing others, creating narratives that highlighted American successes at Bastogne and during the counteroffensive while largely ignoring the units that were overrun during the offensive's first days and whose soldiers spent the war's final months as prisoners. Callahan participated in oral history projects that sought to document the experiences of prisoners of war. His willingness to discuss aspects of his captivity that he had never shared with family or friends, contributing to more complete historical record of what happened to the thousands of soldiers who were captured when German attacks achieved surprise and overwhelmed thinly held positions. The interviews required revisiting memories that Callahan had spent years trying to suppress. The emotional cost of recounting his surrender and the months of hunger and cold in German camps being significant, but justified by the belief that future generations should understand the full reality of war, including the defeats and suffering that patriotic narratives preferred to minimize in favor of celebrating victories and heroism. The diagnosis of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder did not occur until Callahan was in his 60s, when a new generation of psychiatrists trained in understanding combat trauma began recognizing that World War II veterans exhibited patterns of symptoms similar to those seen in Vietnam veterans who had received more systematic psychological support. The formal diagnosis provided some validation that the nightmares, anxiety, and emotional difficulties that Callahan had experienced for decades were not personal failings, but rather normal responses to abnormal experiences. The recognition coming too late to have prevented years of unnecessary suffering, but still offering some relief through understanding that what he had experienced was shared by many combat veterans and was now acknowledged as legitimate medical condition rather than weakness of character. The treatment options available in the 1980s were more developed than what had existed in the immediate post-war period, though by this point the coping mechanisms Callahan had developed over decades were deeply ingrained and difficult to change even with professional support. The group therapy sessions with other World War II veterans provided some benefit through allowing honest discussion of experiences and feelings that had been suppressed for years. The shared acknowledgement of continuing impact that combat had created, validating that moving on did not mean forgetting or pretending that the experiences had not permanently changed those who lived through them. The question of how to communicate his wartime experiences to his children and grandchildren became more pressing as Callahan aged, and as he recognized that the window for sharing first-hand testimony about World War II was closing as the generation that fought the war passed away. His reluctance to burden younger generations with traumatic memories competed with the belief that understanding what war actually involved might make future generations more cautious about supporting military interventions and more appreciative of the costs that warfare imposed on participants, regardless of whether causes were just or whether operations were successful. The conversations with grandchildren who studied World War II in school provided opportunities to offer perspectives that textbooks could not convey, with Callahan emphasizing that the soldiers who fought were ordinary young men who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances rather than heroes who had eagerly sought combat and who had never experienced fear or doubt. The acknowledgement that he had surrendered rather than fighting to the death required overcoming shame that had persisted for decades, despite rational understanding that his decision had been correct under the circumstances, and that continued resistance would have served no purpose beyond adding to casualty lists without affecting the battle's outcome. The visits to Europe that Callahan made late in life included returning to the areas in Belgium where he had fought and been captured, the peaceful villages and forests providing stark contrast to his memories of those December days when the landscape had been a battlefield where men killed and died in frozen conditions that made survival difficult even without enemy action. The local memorials erected by Belgian communities honoring American soldiers who had fought to liberate their country provided moving testimony that the sacrifices had been appreciated and remembered by those who benefited from them. The gratitude expressed by elderly Belgians who remembered the war years validating that his service had meant something, despite the personal costs and despite his capture before the battle's outcome was decided. The American military cemeteries where thousands of his fellow soldiers were buried offered sobering reminder of how fortunate he had been to survive when so many others had not. The rows of white crosses and stars of David marking graves of men whose potential had been extinguished before they could build the post-war lives that Callahan had been privileged to live. The pilgrimage to these sites created some measure of closure, though it also reinforced how randomly fate had determined who lived and who died when the circumstances of combat offered no clear correlation between virtue or skill and survival. The evolving public memory of World War II that transformed the conflict from recent traumatic experience into nostalgic celebration of the greatest generation created discomfort for Callahan, who recognized that the popular understanding emphasized heroism and unity while minimizing the fear, confusion, and moral ambiguity that characterized actual combat experience. The celebration of veterans as heroes felt hollow when his own strongest memory was of surrender rather than triumph, and the portrayal of the war as unambiguous struggle between good and evil ignored the complexity of situations where soldiers made impossible choices and where survival often required moral compromises that were difficult to reconcile with idealized narratives. His participation in public commemorations and his willingness to speak with students and community groups about his experiences reflected a desire to complicate the simplified narratives while still honoring the service and sacrifice of his generation. The balance between validating that the war had been necessary and acknowledging its terrible costs being difficult to maintain when audiences wanted either pure celebration or complete condemnation, rather than nuanced assessment that reflected actual experience. The final years of Callahan's life brought reflection on how his wartime experiences had shaped his entire adult life in ways both obvious and subtle. The recognition that those few months in combat and captivity had influenced every subsequent decision and relationship, creating complex feelings about whether the impacts had been primarily negative or whether they had also produced some positive effects, including resilience and perspective, that might not have developed through more conventional life trajectory. The physical health issues that accumulated with age included some that were directly attributable to his wartime service, including joint problems from the frostbite he had suffered in frozen foxholes, and digestive issues that doctors suggested might be related to the months of malnutrition during his captivity. The delayed consequences of those experiences continuing to extract costs decades after the events themselves. The Veterans Administration medical system that provided his health care in his final years was better equipped to address service-connected conditions than it had been in the immediate post-war period, though the bureaucracy and the sometimes indifferent treatment that veterans received created frustrations that were particularly galling to men who had sacrificed so much and who felt entitled to better care from the nation they had served. The satisfaction that Callahan derived from his life achievements, including his successful career, his long marriage, and his children and grandchildren who had opportunities that his generation's sacrifices had helped secure, provided counterweight to the traumatic memories that had never entirely faded. His conclusion that the war had been necessary despite its costs reflected his understanding of what Nazi Germany had represented and what would have happened if the Allies had not defeated Hitler. The liberation of concentration camps and the revelation of the Holocaust providing moral clarity that justified the suffering, even though it could not erase the pain or restore what had been lost. The question of whether different tactical or strategic decisions might have prevented his capture or might have reduced casualties during the Battle of the Bulge remained unanswerable, but was rendered somewhat moot by the ultimate Allied victory that vindicated the overall strategy, even though individual operations had not always succeeded, and even though many soldiers had paid terrible prices for mistakes made by commanders operating with incomplete information under extreme pressure. The passing of his wife after nearly 6 decades of marriage left Callahan increasingly isolated during his final years, as mobility issues limited his activities, and as fewer of his wartime comrades remained alive to share memories and perspectives that civilians could not fully appreciate. The annual division reunions that had been major events attended by hundreds of veterans dwindled to small gatherings as the generation aged and died, the diminishing numbers providing stark reminder that the direct connection to World War II would soon be lost entirely as the last veterans passed away, and the war transitioned from living memory to history that existed only in documents and recordings. Callahan's participation in oral history projects intensified during these final years as he recognized the urgency of documenting experiences before they were lost. His interviews with historians and students providing detailed accounts of combat and captivity that would preserve knowledge of what soldiers had actually experienced in ways that official records and sanitized histories could not capture. The willingness to revisit painful memories for the sake of historical accuracy represented a final service that required courage, different from but perhaps no less significant than the courage displayed in combat decades earlier. The death of Robert Callahan in 2008 at age 86 removed another voice from the dwindling chorus of World War II veterans who could provide first-hand testimony about the conflict that had shaped the 20th century and that continued influencing global politics into the 21st century. His funeral included military honors with a flag-draped coffin and a veteran honor guard, the ceremony acknowledging his service while also marking the passing of a man whose life had encompassed far more than his military service, even though those experiences had profoundly shaped everything that followed. The obituary published in his local newspaper summarized his life in conventional terms, noting his combat service, his capture and imprisonment, his education under the GI Bill, his career as an engineer, and his survival by children and grandchildren. But these bare facts could not capture the internal struggle and the hard-won peace that had characterized his 70 years of civilian life after returning from the war. The legacy he left included not only his family and his professional accomplishments, but also the recorded testimony about his experiences that would help future generations understand what combat and captivity had been like for the ordinary soldiers who fought World War II without the celebrity or recognition that accrued to senior commanders and medal recipients whose stories dominated popular histories. The historical significance of Callahan's experience and that of thousands of other soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge lay not in any individual heroism that could be celebrated through conventional narratives, but rather in their demonstration that war's reality included defeat and suffering alongside victory and triumph. The Battle of the Bulge had been an Allied victory in the strategic sense that German offensive was stopped and ultimately reversed, but for the units that were overrun during the initial attacks, and for the soldiers who spent months as prisoners, the experience was one of failure and loss that could not be redeemed by the larger victory. The integration of these stories of defeat into the historical narrative created more complete and honest accounting of what the war had involved and of what victory had cost in human terms that transcended casualty statistics and strategic assessments. Callahan's willingness to discuss his capture and imprisonment rather than maintaining silence about experiences that seemed shameful compared to the celebrated heroism of other units contributed to this more comprehensive historical understanding that acknowledged the full range of wartime experiences, including those that did not fit neatly into patriotic narratives. The lessons that could be drawn from Callahan's experience extended beyond the specific tactical and strategic questions about the Battle of the Bulge, to encompass broader insights about the nature of war and about the long-term costs that combat imposed on participants regardless of whether they were physically wounded. The recognition that psychological trauma was real and lasting rather than a temporary adjustment difficulty that would resolve naturally with time represented important evolution in understanding that came too late to help Callahan's generation, but that benefited subsequent generations of veterans who received more systematic mental health support. The acknowledgement that soldiers could behave courageously and still be defeated through no fault of their own challenged simplistic narratives that attributed defeat to moral or tactical failures rather than to the fog of war and the role of chance in determining outcomes of specific engagements. The understanding that prisoners of war were not somehow lesser soldiers than those who avoided capture complicated heroic narratives while providing more nuanced appreciation of the randomness that often determined who survived and in what condition. The commemoration of the Battle of the Bulge in the decades following the war evolved from immediate post-war focus on American resilience at Bastogne toward more comprehensive understanding that acknowledged the full scope of the fighting, including the initial German successes and the heavy American casualties during the offensive's first days. The creation of museums and memorials in Belgium and Luxembourg, where the fighting occurred, preserved physical evidence of the battle while providing educational resources for visitors seeking to understand what had happened in the forests and villages that had been transformed into battlefields during December 1944 and January 1945. The American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries, where thousands of American soldiers killed during the Bulge were buried, became sites of pilgrimage for veterans and families seeking to honor the dead and to connect with the history of sacrifices made in the cause of defeating Nazi Germany. The interpretation of the battle that these memorials and museums provided emphasized both the strategic significance of stopping the German offensive and the human cost measured in lives lost and in trauma that survivors carried for the remainder of their lives. The dual focus attempting to balance celebration of victory with honest acknowledgement of what that victory had cost. The scholarly analysis of the Battle of the Bulge that developed through military histories and academic studies examined the operational and strategic decisions that shaped the campaign, with particular attention to the intelligence failures that allowed Germany to achieve surprise despite multiple indicators that should have warned Allied commanders about the impending offensive. The question of whether different American dispositions in the Ardennes or more aggressive responses during the battle's first hours might have reduced casualties and shortened the fighting remained subjects of debate among historians, who analyzed the available evidence from both Allied and German perspectives. The consensus that emerged recognized that, while mistakes had been made at various levels of command, the ultimate Allied victory vindicated the strategic decisions, even though tactical execution had been flawed, and even though individual units had paid terrible prices for command errors or for the fog of war that made perfect decision-making impossible under combat conditions. The rehabilitation of the reputation of units like the 106th Division that had been overrun during the offensive's opening days occurred gradually as historians recognized that these divisions had been placed in untenable positions and had fought as well as could be expected given the circumstances they faced, their defeat reflecting German success in achieving surprise rather than any fundamental failure of American soldiers or junior leaders. The transformation of Callahan's story from personal trauma that he rarely discussed into historical testimony that contributed to public understanding of the Battle of the Bulge illustrated how the passage of time and the evolution of cultural attitudes toward war could create space for more honest engagement with difficult experiences. The shame that he had initially felt about surrendering gave way to recognition that his decision had been correct under the circumstances, and that the survival of himself and his men through surrender, rather than futile resistance unto death, represented successful leadership rather than failure. The validation that came from historians and from younger generations who appreciated his willingness to share difficult memories provided some measure of peace that had been absent during the decades when he struggled alone with trauma that society preferred to ignore or minimize. The recognition that his experience was valuable precisely because it deviated from heroic narratives demonstrated maturation in how American culture engaged with military history, the willingness to acknowledge complexity and ambiguity representing progress beyond the simplistic narratives that had dominated immediate post-war commemoration. The final assessment of what the Battle of the Bulge meant in the broader context of World War II and in the lives of men like Callahan who fought there concluded that the offensive represented Germany's last desperate gamble that failed strategically while succeeding tactically in demonstrating that German forces retained significant combat capability even in the war's final months. The casualties inflicted on American forces during the battle were substantial, with approximately 90,000 Americans killed, wounded, captured, or missing, these losses representing the largest American casualties in any single battle during the European War, and demonstrating that victory was never inevitable despite Allied material superiority. The experience of soldiers captured during the Bulge illustrated how quickly tactical situations could deteriorate and how ordinary soldiers could find themselves in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own, their stories complicating narratives of American military dominance while providing more realistic understanding of warfare's unpredictability and its capacity to create suffering that transcended battlefield outcomes. The recognition that thousands of American soldiers spent the war's final months as prisoners, rather than as liberators challenging German positions, complicated the triumphant narratives of steady Allied advance toward victory. Acknowledging that the path to VE Day included defeats and setbacks alongside the more celebrated successes. The legacy that Callahan and his generation left extended beyond their military service to encompass the post-war world they built, through their labors in rebuilding economies, raising families, and creating the prosperity that characterized the post-war decades in America and Western Europe. The GI Bill that enabled Callahan's education represented investment in human capital that paid enormous dividends as millions of veterans used educational benefits to gain skills that drove economic growth and innovation. The families that veterans raised transmitted values and perspectives shaped by wartime experiences, creating generations that understood both the necessity of occasionally using military force to defend freedom and the terrible costs that warfare imposed on participants and societies. The civic engagement and community leadership that many veterans provided brought military values of discipline and service into civilian contexts where they influenced how communities functioned and how citizens understood their obligations to each other and to the nation. The gradual acknowledgement that war created lasting psychological wounds that required treatment rather than stoic silence represented cultural evolution that benefited not only World War II veterans, but subsequent generations who served in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts where the recognition of combat trauma as legitimate medical condition rather than personal weakness created better support systems and more humane treatment of those who had sacrificed in military service. The story of Robert Callahan and the thousands of other soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge served as reminder that war's reality included defeat and suffering alongside victory and heroism, that courage could coexist with capture, and that soldiers who did their duty and still lost battles deserved recognition and honor, alongside those whose stories ended in triumph. The comprehensive understanding of the Battle of the Bulge that incorporated these stories of initial defeat alongside the celebrated successes at Bastogne and during the counteroffensive provided more complete and honest accounting of what happened during that brutal winter when the outcome of World War II's European theater remained uncertain, and when individual soldiers faced tests that revealed character and challenged every assumption about their own capabilities and limitations. The preservation of these stories through oral histories, memoirs, and historical documentation ensured that future generations would have access to unvarnished accounts of what combat and captivity involved, allowing them to make informed judgments about when military force was necessary and what costs society should be willing to accept in pursuit of national objectives that might require asking young men and women to risk their lives in service of causes larger than themselves.